All right, now we will look at, after having gone through the various strategy components and the marketing mix for organizations, I would now like to analyze my thoughts in a different perspective. I would now like to focus exclusively on a particular issue as part of strategic management is concerned, is business ethics. So what is very, very important is in today's world is ethics in business. Some of the profound management institutes, some very reputed institutes, talk about the word called ethical dilemma. We all deal with this case of ethical dilemma, which basically talks about you have a doubt as to what ethically ought to be correct. What ethically is ought to be correct. What in your mind, what as per your ethics, your value judgments, your beliefs, your perceptions, your ideas and your thoughts, what do you think is a correct action? And the dilemma is the doubt, or what I call the uncertainty. Or even better, to be more clear about this, is about ambiguity. Some sort of doubt or confusion which you have regarding ethical practices. So ethical dilemma stems from identifying ethical practice. So what we'll discuss primarily now is looking at what exactly is business ethics. What are we trying to imply about business ethics? Business ethics talks about values, cultures, practices, policies, functioning of an organization as per ethics, ethical practices, what you think is correct and what you think is appropriate. Now, business ethics says, now all of us know that we are here with a vision of fulfilling certain objectives. And this is where I would like to draw a distinction between economic objectives and social objectives. Economic objectives, of course, is profit driven, whereas social objectives is maintaining societal value. You are doing something for society. I'll be discussing this in more depth when I go into the corporate social responsibility. But the fact is, social objectives talk about your societal values, your objectives towards society. But either way, the way you define economic or social objectives is, business ethics is the way the organization and at the same time ensures that the organization maintains its values, cultures, practices, policies and functioning which is perceived to be fair and honest. So basically what I've emphasized is business ethics. In other words, conduct your business operations maintaining your ethics, ethical practices. So in other words, your business is an entity, or what I call is an enterprise. And an enterprise which must adopt ethical practices. Now, ethical means, ethics is something which is correct, appropriate, something which is acceptable to society. Now, ethical practices would mean all practices, whatever you do ethical, is something with the focus on stakeholders. Focus on stakeholders and focuses on the environment. In other words, the practices, policies, actions, style of functioning, culture, etc., is executed in a manner which is considered to be fair, honest, and accepted. So what we look at is fair practices, honest practices, equitable practice, now the logic is under strategic management. Who are you accountable for? Now you're doing all this fair, honest, equitable practices. Who is it that you're accountable for? Who uses your products and services? Well, one is, the most important is the consumer. Second is shareholders. The next is the government. Next is your employees. And of course, maybe you can just include the suppliers, the ones who are immediate stakeholders, who you have close proximity. So if you look at this flow chart, a business is an entity or an enterprise or a going concern which has to adopt ethical practices. What do we mean by ethical practices? By ethics, I mean using your ethics, your mindset, your moral values. Let's put down the word here, your moral values, which focuses on your stakeholders and focus on the environment. In other words, you're operating in an environment to fulfill objectives as per stakeholders' expectations. Now, all of us in school have studied moral science. What is morally correct? What is morally commitment? What is moral commitment? That means something within which you feel that what you're doing is correct and fair and honest. So in other words, the moral values, the moral principles, the moral values, the moral principles, the rules, regulations. I'll just go through one by one slowly for all of you to have an initial grasp at this. What I'm saying is, organizations should have moral values. Now, it also involves culture and so and so forth, style of functioning, the culture, the actions, the policies, the practices. So all these values, practices, policies, actions, and principles, rules, regulations, the objective is to ensure that the organizations adopts ethical practices. And by ethical practices, we mean the moral values or the way of functioning is something which deals with fairness, honesty, equitable, and actions which are considered to be accepted by society and justified. Now, actions are for whom? The government is you're accountable to the government, you're accountable to your shareholders, you're accountable to your consumers, you're accountable to your employees, and you're accountable to your suppliers. Now, let me be very honest with you. The way the organization functions and the ethical practice it maintains, that also leads to an image creation. I mean, today, if you look at a classic example, what happened in the Indian corporates was the case of Satyam Mehta's. It is the lack of governance which led to a virtual bankruptcy. A lot of organizations have gone through, like Olympus, one of the biggest camera companies, Olympus. Well, the bosses have been accountable and they've been now recommended for delisting from the Japanese markets. So this is where the fact is the image gets dented. You're no longer considered to be an organization of repute delivering quality services and delivering your promises of fair, honest, equitable, justified, and acceptable practices. The Satya Mehta's case was a case of financial irregularity. It is a case of financial irregularity, where if there are unfair practices or dishonesty or corruption, bribery which crept in, that destroys your image. So ethics leads to creation of image. So one of the ways of sustaining good image is to follow ethical practices. Now, to be honest, at times it happens that despite your ethical practices, if your organization has been recording poor financial performance over a span of number of years, we always call it that maybe management is at fault, or management is not run it properly, or the industry competition is severe, or the strategies are not appropriate. Those are industries in competition, strategy is not appropriate, management not, but ethical practices may really dent or damage your identity and image. And what we are looking at under business ethics is ethical practices, image creation. It is an action. It's business ethics, therefore, talks about your ethical behavior in the organization, where you operate within the boundary of the environment with your resources to satisfy stakeholder expectations. And what does ethics mean? Ethics means preserving the moral values, the practices, the policies, the actions the organization undertakes, the style of functioning, the organization cultures, the moral principles, rules, and regulations under which the organization operates. We need to understand that they're considered to be fair practices, equitable, which means we treat everyone equal in society. It's honest dealings in the organization, ethical practices, justified actions, and acceptable actions. And the fact is, you're accountable, the organization is accountable to consumers, shareholders, government, employees. And so, on the backdrop of all this, I would like to say that this is what we are heading towards. And therefore, one needs to maintain this and make sure that ethical practices are followed very rigorously in various. Now, next we move on to see what could be unethical practices And let's give some examples of business ethics. Now, what is considered unethical as part of strategic management? Let's have a look at this. Suppose you're manufacturing a product, say X, and you're involved in cheating customers. How do you cheat customers? Unnecessarily high price, poor quality, delivery versus performance. Mismatch, not adhering to customer needs. So all this is where you cheat your customer. That's very much unethical. In other words, whatever is perceived to be unfair, wherever there is dishonesty, wherever you see corruption, these are cases of unethical practices and they can destroy your image. All this, they destroy image. Look at the example, critical example here. Let's have a look at the telecom organizations. What you call the telecom malfunctioning, what has happened. The Supreme Court has ordered that, 122 circles. I mean, that's the way it is, that for some reason they haven't gone about in the right way. So it's a sort of I wouldn't say a scandal, but the fact is some unfair practices have taken place. We need to assess that, but the fact is telecom industry, that's why it's going through doldrums because of this high payout costs. If we look at examples, there were also examples of the Satya Mehta's case. This is a case where a lot of malpractices, financial irregularity took place. And of course now Tech Mahindra has taken over. So as a result, things are a little different now. But now again, a case of India, of course, was a case of Enron, the power project. So these are what I call unfair practices. Enron is a power project which was earlier power. The government took initiative in Gujarat, where this Enron project, because of many, and somehow the reporting was poor and some incorrect information was given out, and that really ethical practices happen everywhere, but something which comes sharply into focus is something where the image gets destroyed very rapidly. And to recover from that could take a long time. There are a lot of news which can come out. These are certain things. I just gave an example. These were the cases where it was considered to be somewhat unethical. And any deal where you have unfair or dishonesty or corruption or destroying image is something which is considered to be unethical. Another way of unethical practice could be, cheating your shareholders. An organization can lead to cheating of shareholders. Now, cheating of shareholders happen in a time when you overstate your profits. Overstate profits. The common term is what I call window dressing. You window dress your balance sheet profit and loss. You overstate your profits, the share price goes up. Those are things which are not done. Any false reporting of facts. So ethics means if you do things which are fair, honest, with less corruption, it boosts your image, your moral values, your principles is as per your stakeholders' objectives. That's what I'm saying. Your shareholders have certain objectives, you cheat them. Your customers objectives, you have certain objectives towards your customers, you cheat them. And that is where it goes wrong. And then if you're an employee, when you suffer this, you really suffer a big setback in the image. What sort of company you're working for, we all think. What are we working for? Unethical practices. Where you're not fair to your consumers, you're not. Another thing is corruption. Now, this is what I would like to say examples: bribery, corruption. These are considered to be ethical, unethical rather. These are considered to be unethical. These are examples where ethics fail. But an ethical dilemma is something different. Where you remember you're in a bit of a doubt or a dilemma as to what is the most appropriate choice. Suppose you have 3 or 4 decisions. Ethics wise, what do you think is dilemma? What do you think is something which is ought to be correct? What do you think is right? What do you think is wrong? If you have a choice, there may not be any perfect answer. That's a dilemma. But unethical is something where you get into malpractices. I'll use the word malpractices. That's called malpractices. Now, for example, if it so happens your technology is poor, you're not innovating technology as is required. So, this is where you get engaged in not doing what you're supposed to do. You promise something to your customers, you're not able to deliver because you haven't changed your technology. Bribery, corruption takes place. In other words, you get things done through bribery, corruptions. Well, or you get engaged in that. Now, small levels happen, I presume, in most nations of the world. But the fact is, we should not get into too much of unethical modes of operation. So, what I would like to say under this context is that business ethics is an important part as an important part of strategic management. And to ensure that ethics is what the organization really believes in, to enforce this ethical practices, one of the strategies which was taken is the corporate governance. Corporate governance means you make individuals accountable. You have clarity of role, and you have accountability of individuals and employees. That's what makes it important. And what is very important is disclosure of information, which makes it transparency. That is one of the best ways to ensure that your practices become ethical under all contexts. Any unethical practices could definitely be tracked if you make people accountable, if you clarify their roles, and there is a strong disclosure system which brings about transparency. And this is where audit is most crucial. Conduct audits. Audits means reviewing your performance. That's what is called audits, corporate governance. So corporate governance is an indirect way by which you govern the organization and you go through many issues to bring about accountability and disclosure of information. Now, there are many ways of enforcing corporate governance, but one of the ways is what I call the audit system. And this is a great way to actually come out with facts that a governance issue is lacking. So, as part of strategy, when you manage strategy, we need to look at two things: ethics, that means morally doing what you feel is right for your stakeholders, for your society, your customers, your employees, and your stakeholders. And to ensure ethical practices to take place and your strategy is implemented appropriately, you bring about a system of corporate. And this is where your audit systems have to be very, very strengthened. You report as per the US GAAP system or your accounting norms. And that's where governance issues come about. And also, the directors play a very important role for governance and bringing about ethics. It's the leaders and directors which ensure this. This is where you need leadership, role of directors. Lead the organization, make directors ensure that the people are accountable and there's clarity of role and people performance is measured and there's disclosure and transparency of information. So these are the basic issues which we need to look at, we need to focus on addressing the level of awareness of business ethics. So now when we are summarizing, when you do a summary, the first thing is we define what is business ethics. Ethics is moral values, principles, policies, actions which have to be implemented keeping in mind fairness and honesty and equitable concept. This is very, very important. And the second thing is when organizations do witness ethical dilemma, that's a different issue altogether. Ethical dilemma means ethical doubts. And thirdly, we are looking at, apart from ethics and ethical dilemma, the third thing that we look at is what under dilemma, what under ethics can be best covered. And the most important point to highlight under this context is that we look at unethical practices which have to be avoided. Avoid unethical practices. Avoid unethical practices. And very importantly, lastly, we should put forward a system to ensure business ethics that is called the corporate governance. That means govern and lead the organization. How do you ensure that? Through transparency, through audits, and clarity. These are the issues under what I cover under business ethics. So corporates formulate strategies, which are a set of action plans. But the way you implement action plans, corporates must remember that ethical standards, ethical practices ethical values have to be sustained. No ethics, no image. And at the end of the day, it is your ethical ideas and concepts, behavior, which help you to build your image. Your focus point is your image, your reputation. Your reputation is on ethics. Those are the important issues. Business ethics. Thank you very much.